Welcome back, friends, fellow philosophers, and authors to this Wild Isle writing cast. I have with me an honored guest, Kristin Noland. How are you doing, Kristin?
I'm doing good. How are you doing?
Fantastically. I'm really glad to have you on today. For those of you who won't know who you are, why don't you introduce yourself? Let them know what you do and where they can find your material, your work, your services, anything you want to offer.
Okay. I'm Kristin Noland. I edit speculative and crime fiction. I own Noland Editing, and you can find that at nolandediting.com. And yeah, that's me. I've edited around just over 70 books so far. And I have two bestsellers that I've edited, not that I've written yet. But yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Thank you, Kristen. So, any of you listening out there looking for an editor, check out her website. We'll have that all linked below in the description. And you can also check out my website, as you guys know, wildislet.com, where I host all kind of things, excerpts, short stories, essays, blog posts. You can check out my novel there, Wand Smoke Broken, a weird fantasy fiction novel with, let's say, gas lamp and steampunk elements kind of thrown in there. I always describe it as reading kind of like a Western, though some people kind of disagree with that. Anyway, check that out. It's all on audio for free, again, over at wildislet.com, as well as the rest of these podcasts. And if you're looking for a line editor in particular, you can check out the Wild Isle Style Guide over at my website. I can help you refine your manuscript in style so that you are not merely writing down and slapping down content, that you are composing something that is a joy to read, embedding music in your manuscript. All right, enough of that. We're going to get on to the topic today, which I have hopefully cleverly named Reading Your Vegetables, with the question: is it vital to read outside of your preferred, and I've kind of added to this since I brought Kristen on, but your genre, outside of the plot that you prefer, outside of the settings that you prefer? So, should you read stuff that you typically do not like to read? Particularly, we're focusing on the question of authors or also editors, but even if we want to get into dedicated readers who don't write and don't edit, they are the consumer, if you will. We can talk about this question in regards to them as well. So, Kristen, just out of hand, when I ask that question, is it vital to read outside your preferred genre, plot, and setting? What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. Reading in all different kinds of genres gives you the exposure um, to different plot things and setting as well. Especially like if you have an urban fantasy versus a high fantasy, you're going to see how the author takes care of the setting. Most of the time in an urban fantasy, it's not going to be described as much as it would be in a high fantasy. So yes, definitely want to do those things. And the characters in them, their character arcs, also are a little different. Yes, they still have to have them, but it might be smaller in a series crime fiction, smaller over each book, and the larger character arc over the series of the books, as opposed to a standalone, which is going to have the character arc fully formed by the end. Um, yeah. So definitely reading in a wide variety of things, even poetry. Even reading poetry for writing fiction is also helpful. You get the use of language is completely different, and you might want to incorporate some of those techniques in your writing as well.
Yeah, I can't agree more. But we're going to dig into each of those bit by bit as we go, particularly the poetry one. That's actually quite, let's say, was it personal to me, or was it close to my heart? I can't remember the turn of phrase. Um, but we will get into those. Before we dive too deeply in, there's going to be a bit of conundrum about definitions, which is entirely my fault, because I have this Confucian obsession with getting words down to their most functional, say, usages. And so before we dive into exactly why you should read outside and what might happen if you don't, because I think that's worthwhile discussing the opposite end of that as well. I want to pitch some things to you. Now, this is going to be, you don't have to go too deeply into any of these because I've had an individual podcast where I've talked about each of these and then I've developed them over the course of months now. So it's too much to throw all at once to someone fresh. But I wanted to talk about the idea of genre, the idea of plot, and the idea of setting in a way that I think will clarify things for between the two of us and the listeners. So, without further ado, I'll go through those. We'll start one at a time, and then you can tell me what you think. So, here on the Wild Isle podcast, I've been trying to push this idea that uh, genre is kind of a blurry concept that isn't as useful as it could be because we have to continuously add subgenres and subgenres. And the reason why is that we typically are very undisciplined with our use of the word genre, and it's been highly contaminated due to the market using the word and trying to find market categories. So, what I've tried to do um, through reading outside of, let's say, the genre of fiction into nonfiction, because the word genre has been used to apply to those as well, right? Fiction, nonfiction, poetry. I read a lot of philosophy, and I have an idea that when we're talking about genre, it has to have an essence, right? What that means is something it ties down to specifically. And I've thought a lot about what the other elements of literature are, particularly in regards to plot and setting. And if I strip out elements of plot and I strip out elements of setting and I say, what is left for genre if it is to be meaningful? I've kind of come down to the fact that actually genre refers to something like Aristotle's telos, right? It's you could translate that as function. I like to translate it as purpose because as soon as you, or not purpose, sorry, other way around. You could translate it as purpose. I like to think of it as function. The reason why is because if I say the word purpose, people suddenly say, well, different people have different purposes, and that's true. But if I say the word function, a thing does a thing, or it doesn't do that thing, right? Regardless of a person being there, like an acorn grows into an oak tree, regardless of whether or not the person has that purpose for the tree. And without having to reinvent the wheel, what I discovered is actually there are genre categories that work this way. And I've listed a few of them here to give you a rough idea, and then you can very, very shortly tell me what you think of this conception of genre. We'll do the same thing with plot and setting, and then I think that will lay the groundwork so we can continue the conversation very clearly. So for genre, I found thriller, as much as I actually kind of hate the name for it, works pretty well because it fits on to one of our, let's say, biological systems, which is our adrenal system. The same thing is true for horror, right? So if you think of the fight or flight response, thriller is the excitation, that fight response, the moving forward toward a thing, whereas horror is the flight, the fear, the moving away from a thing. And those are, physiological responses. And I even included, in this one, I have a hard time finding a name for, but I think of fiction that's often referred to as spiritual or metaphysical as being that sensation of awe. And that sensation of awe is not quite fear. It's more like that freeze response that you get when you see something too grand for one's own real momentary comprehension and you're just stricken. And then we could go down to some more things like erotica is obviously sexual arousal. And I've even thought of the typically the drama genres of comedy and tragedy being tied down to the dopaminergic and serotonergic systems. Comedy obviously being joyous, and that being the reward mechanism, the happiness that we feel, and then a tragedy being interrelated to, you could say sorrow, but I've looked at it a little bit more deeply, and I think it's related to catharsis in the classic Greek sense, again as described by Aristotle, in which he describes catharsis as being the relief that one feels in a sense that the world is just. When you see a tragedy unfold, the tragic hero who falls actually deserves his or her fall because of their flaw that they don't overcome, which it's sort of like when you provide borders for a child. For any of you people listening who have kids, you'll be very familiar with this. When you provide order, the kid calms down and is actually happier and more well behaved because they can predict the world around them, which means they know how to act so they don't feel lost, which is stable. Well, now serotonin is a tricky neurotransmitter, and we don't, maybe it's not even involved in this, but for the sake of having a word to use, I'll use it. That would stabilize one's serotonergic system so they don't feel terrible and in despair because they're lost. And that's what when I'm thinking of genre and I'm thinking of reading outside one's genre, I'm thinking of someone exploring those different aspects of their own emotional states through fiction or otherwise, in that way. So I just talked for forever. Um, so tell me if you think any of that holds water to you, if that relates to how you think about genre at all, and whether or not that relates to people branching off from what they're used to in terms of genre as I've described it there.
Well, I think you went very deep into your research and your theories. Yeah, I don't really think about that deeply, I guess. And I'm a critical reader, which means I look for the themes and the messages and those kind of things, and how the author gets from, excuse me, how an author in a certain genre gets their messages across, and what their characters' flaws are telling us about things in the setting, how it affects the characters and reflects societal issues in that. So I haven't really gone as deep into my assessment of things like that. I do think it's important to have to experience different reactions to books. So, like when you were saying about the horror versus other genres like erotica, they are two completely different emotional responses, which is very important to have. That emotional responses is important through all types of fiction and nonfiction. That's something that authors do miss a lot. So, yeah, so reading in the different genres and experiencing the different emotional responses and even physical responses, the whole thriller thing, being on the edge of your seat type feeling, versus the romance where you're just relaxed and enjoying a romantic relationship between two people, um, or three, whatever. That those emotional responses there are what we're looking for. So even like we had mentioned, poetry is intensely emotional, and can invoke anything from fear to love to even doubt, doubting yourself and those kind of things. Yeah, so I think in that aspect, it's very important to read all different genres so you get those emotional responses and you see how the author does so. It's a lot about how the author does so when you're writing. So you can get a sense of what techniques they're using in order to get you to feel those things. So I find that is important in the reading diverse books or diversely genre books.
Yeah, I think we could dig and kind of root around there before even moving on. So you brought up the difference in how you're going to make the reader feel, and there are techniques you mentioned that are involved in that, which means in order to reliably, now when I say reliably, I mean like about as reliable as medicine, which means it works most of the time, but there are obviously going to be cases in which a particular literary technique just for some people is just not going to work, even though it works most of the time. So realize listeners out there realize that I'm not speaking in absolutes here, but there are techniques that you can reliably use to excite. There are ones that you can reliably use to titillate, to give someone a sense of calm if you're writing essentially a romantic comedy. And I know that's usually used to apply to film, but there's no reason why we couldn't apply that to literature as well. A romance story that is made to make someone feel happy is kind of by definition, right, a romantic comedy. So I'm curious from your experience as an editor, where you've seen both people succeed at, let's say, the using, let's say, I'll rephrase that. Can you tell when someone is widely read versus when they're not widely read in terms of their ability to apply elements outside of the genre that they happen to be writing in, right? And let me know if that question isn't very clear.
No, I can understand what you're saying. I don't know that you can tell that they haven't read widely, but you can tell when they're trying to mimic a certain style or a certain type of book. Um, a lot of the times in fantasy, people get caught up on the setting descriptions. And in a lot of popular high fantasy novels, there is a lot of emphasis put on the setting. In my opinion, I like the faster paced books. So when I'm editing, if I come across like 3 paragraphs of setting description without any action, it becomes boring to me. Other people might really enjoy it. So there's a difference in people like that. But what I think is best is to put action within the scene setting descriptions. So with the characters interacting in their experiences with the setting. So just taking like a huge mountain range that's being described, someone exiting a field and seeing this huge mountain range, there's a tendency to describe the entire mountain, everything there, that from the sparse trees to the deciduous trees to the rock formations and the snow on the top. There's a tendency to describe all of that without having the character move. So they're just standing there static and looking at all of this and describing it instead of maybe traversing the plain that's covered in snow first and describing the crunch of it and the depth of it with, they're picking up their foot and really trying to get to the next step, and they're and then they make it to the tree line and then describe some of the trees that are there and then go through the forest and up, just describe it as they're moving, as they're interacting with it. Maybe they stop and build a fire and you can describe certain things that are there. So instead of just a blanket, here's everything right in front of you, kind of like a movie would pan across, you need to have the character move within that. So in that regard, I think a lot of people may stick to one genre of reading those kind of things, and that's what they want to emulate, and that's great. But you do need to read something else that's in the lower fantasy, or like I'd mentioned, urban fantasy, or even sci-fi, the way they describe those things that are less familiar to us. And see how they do it through the characters' actions, or do they just stand there and list off the items that they see? So like in urban fantasy, you might have a character walking down a street in a warehouse area. Do I need to describe the buildings now? I've told you it's a warehouse area. We basically already know what those kind of things look like. So in that regard, you're going to describe what's different. So you're walking in a warehouse area and you see this magic shop that's in like this nestled in this little place in between 2 big buildings. You're going to want to describe that magic shop. Even if it's not the place, the destination of your character, you're going to want to describe that a little bit more because it's out of place. So those kind of things. If you mention something about somebody being in a garage, well, people know what a garage looks like. Maybe mention it's a 2-story or a 2-car garage, and then it'll expand their vision of a garage. And describe maybe certain things that are piled in a corner, like maybe a kid's bike is in the corner that's been disused for so long because something happened to that child. Maybe they were kidnapped or something. But what's important is the fact that it's been there and it's got cobwebs on it and it's a sad reminder. So that's what you're going to concentrate on describing. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. And so the elements in particular that you pointed out are in relation to character, right? A lot of them. So, like, if the child's missing, that might be, or plot for that matter. So, plot or character. Like the bike being there is going to be mentioned if it's relevant to the plot, or if it's relevant to a character that's relevant to the plot, that it's going
Yeah,
to affect how the other characters interact, right?
absolutely.
And that, yeah, and with urban, what we typically call urban fantasy, yeah, absolutely, because it's contemporary, it allows the reader to, let's say, make assumptions that you don't as easily get away with if you're doing something like high fantasy, where the rules of that particular speculative universe could be different, and so you can't take as much for granted. Another solution that I thought up too, in regards to fantasy, and then I think we can go ahead and jump genres to see if we could, think of some more examples, is like, if you read nonfiction or if you read poetry, because we mentioned reading outside even the genres of fiction, for inspiration, for techniques. When I think of nonfiction, I think of something like a memoir. And what I've noticed about memoirs or nonfiction accounts that I've read, particularly ones that are good, is that the author isn't merely describing what is happening. Often he or she is describing how he or she felt in that moment, right? So it's not just, if it's a war memoir, it's not merely that, okay, well, we're describing the battle I was in. Most of it isn't. It's like a single few minutes where it takes up several pages, because what's being described is the camaraderie among, himself and his fellow soldiers, how he felt knowing that, like, maybe there was like a probably a tank around this corner and he had to check, and it was like the fear and terror of, turning the corner and looking down the barrel of some massive gun, or watching your, I don't know if you're a British officer, you're watching the commander literally pace at the top of a trench while he's being literally sniped at, just to keep the morale of his men up, and how that felt to, like, watch that guy and, like, question, like, I couldn't be so brave. For nonfiction accounts, that's what they focus on, right? It's not merely what's happening, but how does it make the characters feel? Interiority is a word that, as pretentious as it is, that I learned in grad school to use for that. Poetry, though, also is incredibly useful, because what we do when we write poetry is we express ourselves figuratively. That's really, not universally, but a lot of what makes poetry what it is the use of figurative language, and then sound as well. But let's focus on figurative language to not have the conversation go too far in a field. And let's say if you read a lot of high fantasy, a lot of it is raw discursion. What do I mean by that? I mean, it's literal description about stuff that's happening, and that is actually rather inefficient. It's actually extremely inefficient. Um, if you're familiar with the phrase "a picture is worth a thousand words," then the idea that imagery conveys a lot of information very fast, and through figures of speech, you can evoke imagery in literature, which isn't restrained to just visual images, but imagery in literature is also the sounds, the smells, the feels, right, the tastes of things. And if you can, through metaphor, through simile, through allusion, bring about that imagery, and you'll learn how to do if you read a decent amount of poetry, because they'll be doing it line after line after line. Then you could take that long, slow description and you could shrink it down, and the use of that, it gives you so much more time in order to explore those other areas. Your paragraph suddenly has room for that interiority, or you can move the character along, you can move the plot along, because you have the space now to do it. You've described what you needed to describe in a much more efficient way through that use of figurative language. All right, so that would be, like, let's say if we had an author of fantasy incorporating other elements. um, what if we had some other type of writer? Let's go the opposite direction for fantasy. Let's say we have someone who writes, um, I don't know if you had anybody like this. They write uh, something like contemporary Christian fiction, something like that. I'm trying to think of something like that typically reads very differently than, let's say, something like a high fantasy novel. Um, what examples of, let's say, cross genre reading or cross, just stories in general outside of what that person normally reads might be applied to someone who's writing like a contemporary drama, something like I described there. It doesn't have to be the what's it called, contemporary Christian fiction novel. It can be something like that. What other places might they be able to read to get inspiration and learn other techniques, you think?
Well, definitely read some nonfiction for sure. The memoirs, memoirs do evoke a lot of emotions, whereas your nonfiction is going to be more factual and like a step-by-step type process, which makes things more concise. And so you get that concise, here's the fact type writing in those. And then we discuss poetry, which also helps you be concise because every word in poetry is important. It's the word choice and how you can say a lot with just 5 words. So like you said, that gives you room in other genres if you can get that, emotion evoked in 5 words, then you can move the plot forward. Or if you can get a setting description done in 5 to 10 words, then you've got that ability to give your facts or move your story forward. You've got room for that. But nonfiction, there's a little bit of a problem with nonfiction and writing fiction, I think. And that comes with point of view because nonfiction is written either in first or second person, where you're talking specifically to the reader and putting them in the situation. And then in first person, where it's all being described from the person who's writing its perspective. So there is a little issue with that because in fiction, you can write in all different kinds, but we call it breaking the fourth wall, talking to the reader. If it's in third person or omniscient, breaking that fourth wall isn't advised. And we read a lot of that in the nonfiction books. And so we get used to reading that. So at times it can be somewhat of a hindrance because you have to pay attention to how it's written and why it's written that way. Nonfiction is written in first or second person because they're trying to get that message to the reader directly. It's a conversation between the author and the reader, direct conversation, as opposed to third person, where most of the fiction is written. It is getting more and more first person. With younger readers, I think they like that first person more, which is kind of talking to the reader, but you're not like in second person and actually bringing them into the scene. But I do think it does help with, excuse me, seeing how the authors get their point across. Like I said, nonfiction is going to be pretty much straight to the point, which can help in fiction because there are times where you do want to be straight to the point. You want to get to that point as fast as possible. Is there something
Yeah,
else you want to know?
no, I think that was pretty thorough. Yeah, that is good to point out the possible hindrances. I've seen this with a lot of, I hate to say it this way, but somewhat artistically minded male authors who read lots and lots and lots and lots of nonfiction. I might even be one of these potential, what's the word, demographics, right? I read a lot of philosophy. I read a lot of nonfiction as much as I do fiction. And there is a danger in taking on the narrative voice that is present
Mhm.
in nonfiction. And if you already have a propensity to do that, like so say if you write fantasy and then you read a bunch of nonfiction, the voice of nonfiction is actually going to exacerbate the problems that are already there when if you read a lot of, let's say, classic fantasy. Now, it can be helpful even within, let's say, a genre. Let's say you stick with fantasy for just a second. If you read both older classic books and then more modern books, because as you pointed out, the change in perspective will change the narrative voice. And I think that that can help to overcome some of the hindrances, right? Or going from, let's say, more technical books, which are going to be much more direct, dry, second person accounts, to adding memoirs as well within the realms of nonfiction, because those are going to be much more personal. And then reading across perspectives, like don't just read stories that are all written in, let's say, first person or second person in the case of nonfiction. Quite a lot of the time, also read things in third person. Don't just read in third limited or third omniscient, right? Like try to vary it so you can see the difference between how the different narrators and those narrators' positions in regard to you and the story um, affect the way that the story is told. So we stuck a lot on genre. What about, we could talk about plot, we could talk about setting. We kind of have already. I'll jump into this idea of setting because I think it'll be a little bit more interesting. So I've had a couple conversations with a number of speculative fiction writers, and have actually come to think of settings as being a lot of what we think of when we think of genre is attributable to setting, but there is a bifurcation there in setting. And I think the word speculative can be paired with the word prescriptive. I think that speculative is fundamentally descriptive, right? So when we write a speculative story, then the most archetypal example of this is perhaps science fiction, but we are speculating about what if this thing was different. And I think this will make sense just going through the small list I have here. So, setting speculative fiction, you could have historical fiction, right? And a lot of, now, this doesn't have to be the case. You can put like a random mystery story in a historical setting, and then it's a mystery story. Is it necessarily, it could be prescriptive, it could be descriptive. But for the sake of what's usually the case, a lot of historical fiction is like, okay, well, what if this happened in this point in history, right? So it's almost like alternative history. In fact, it
Yep.
quite literally is alternative history, right? So you're speculating on an alternative history. The same thing is true, I think, for all literary fiction that are set in contemporary settings. It's okay, if this happened now, what would be the result? Again, describing the consequences of a, let's say, change in the current timeline, and then science fiction being the archetype of this. Okay, if we develop this particular technology or cultural change in the future, what's going to happen? Right. And I would pair that with prescriptive. Now, the archetype of prescriptive, I think, is fantasy, because if you look at a lot of fantastical works, a lot of it is set backward in time. And I think the reason why that is because it's hearkening to something like mythology and legend, which are oftentimes essentially moral lessons. They're like fables expanded outward so that the moral is this massive, well, moral lesson. Less so with urban fantasy, and strangely enough, more so with science fantasy, which is how I would describe, the difference between classic science fiction and something like, this is kind of leaving literature, but the easy example for everyone to understand is Star Wars, right? So Star Wars is set in space with a bunch of technology, but it's all functionally magic, and you could take the entire Star Wars story, put it in it's a fantastical setting, much like a lot of classic fantasy is, and you really wouldn't be changing the story very much. So now bring this back around to reading outside what you're used to reading. I think that there are lots of people who are very used to reading speculative set stories, and there are lots of people who are much more used to reading prescriptive stories, right? So uh, to to give an example, then I'll throw it over to you. I experience quite a lot that there are people who are used to reading, let's say, contemporary thriller novels, right? So they have a contemporary setting, and it's like, okay, if I don't know, if these people were to invade these people, or if like a spy from this nation discovered this, what would happen? Um, And there are other readers who are very, very used to reading prescriptive novels. This is, again, your typical fantasy reader who wants to see that kind of good versus evil story played out in front of them. So, why might it be useful for someone who's used to, say, I don't know, reading a contemporary thriller or contemporary like murder mystery novel um, to read maybe something prescriptive like those kind of good and evil stories, or vice versa?
Well, if you're a crime fiction novelist and you're looking for good and evil, or you want to read something about good and evil in fantasy, crime fiction is also about good and evil. We assume that the person who perpetrated the crime is evil in some way. Whereas, in your fantasy, you also have a villain that is the perpetrator. So they all kind of mesh down to specific elements that are across all genres. So that example there is one of them. Um, what I like is when things are turned on their heads a bit. So, what we assume is the villain, why they committed a certain crime or why they did some bad act, is actually, in their view, it is a good thing that they did. So, for murder or for crime, let's say a father commits murder because his daughter was murdered by someone else. In his mind, that murder was justified. And if we read it from the victim's perspective, and then we see the villain's perspective, and we see that they actually are the hero of their own story, that kind of turns it and helps you see things from a different perspective, which I think is also very important, that we see things from a different perspective. So like the speculative fiction you were mentioning, asks the what if question. So what if a typewriter was invented 100 years before it actually was? How would that have affected society? When would we have gotten computers? When would social media, would it have even been social media that came from it? And you take from a different time period with different values of people 100 years before, you're going to have a different result because of the mindset of people. So fantasy, the good and evil, you're also, like I said, you're going to have some kind of crime in there, something that somebody did to hurt someone else, or a plan that maybe, I don't know. Give me an example of, of fantasy with some kind of crime in it.
Well, I've seen in recent years, I think it was like, I didn't read it, but I was paying attention very slightly to what was coming out. I think it's a Six of Crows, something like that. It was a fantasy heist novel,
Okay.
if that makes sense to you.
Yeah.
So the idea would
Yeah.
be, if you've, oh, go ahead, go ahead.
No, I'm saying, yeah, if you were talking about um, stealing something, like you said, a heist, the reason for the person stealing something could be a good reason. What did they do? Let's say they stole food from a restaurant because their entire family's hungry and they haven't eaten for 2 days. So in that aspect, that's a good thing that they stole and provided for their family, whereas the restaurateur is going to see it as an evil thing because they lost money. um, or they're going to lose a customer because that food was stolen and now they have to prepare everything. So it all kind of builds on one another, those things. So, well, honestly, I can't remember the question from the beginning.
No, no, you were answering it there. So the question is like, what could one gain from the other, right? Like if you're reading the examples we were using were like crime fiction, right? Like even like say it's, or even if you go outside of fiction, you're reading like about true crime, how that could
Mm-hmm.
inform someone writing a prescriptive type of story where they are trying to tell some story that has a theme about, let's say, good and evil or human nature, even, right? Because it doesn't have to be even so simplified. You could be trying to really explore a something that would normally be considered literary versus genre, though I kind of detest that distinction. Nonetheless, if you have a very deep theme that you're trying to convey, it's useful to know, well, what are human beings really like? We're not simplistic creatures, and if all you've ever read are very simplistic prescriptive stories, you're not going to be able to tell any type of nuanced story at all. But if you, let's say, read across the aisle there and you investigate into, let's say, some morally gray situations in which, like you mentioned, the crime to the criminal seem to be justified. Like, even if you don't agree, even if you don't intend to show, let's say, the other side as being justified in your own fiction, you will, at the very least, create a much more believable villain, right? And your story will feel, it'll have, the word I would use is a greater amount of verisimilitude. It'll feel more akin to life and be believable. It won't push the suspension of, it won't break, rather, the suspension of disbelief in the reader, right? The reader will feel that there is something right about that kind of story, I think. Now, there's
Okay,
a,
so
go
I
ahead, go
think
ahead.
part of the reason why it's important to read different genres is because the elements of storytelling are pretty much the same throughout all of the fiction. It's pretty much the same. And even in nonfiction, you still have scenes in nonfiction, because they're describing something that happened and the result from that. They describe what they were thinking before they came up with the decision, or the failed plans that they had. All of that is the scene construction of, here's a problem. I looked at the options. So that's the decision, the debate portion of it. And then they make a decision, and then they actually act on it. And did it work? Did it not work? Did it work with just a little bit of movement forward, but then something else held them back and they had to adjust, replan, rethink it, and then finally come up with an excellent solution. All of that is storyline in a scene, in a book. It's the whole storyline. So I think that reading from one genre to another, you still get that sense of storytelling. Same with memoir, nonfiction, all of it. They all has that element of storytelling that is important. I think that's something. And we talked about the emotional responses again. All through all writing, there's the emotional response that you're trying to trigger. So there's a storyline and the emotional response that goes through all genres of writing. So I think it's important because you're looking at things from a different perspective. I know I keep using the word perspective, but you see things from, like we were talking about, like the baddie's perspective. You can see it from there. You see it from the protagonist's perspective. You can also see it from the side character's perspective. Those people who are kind of just on the outside and looking in. That happens a lot when you have a group of people and then they split up, and you see, you get chapters with different people on different journeys. They all see the whole as a little bit differently, and their own journey. You can see the same storyline. That's what the subplots are. It's all the same storyline. I hate to tell you, or storytelling. I hate to say it, but it's true. So I think that's where you benefit from reading all different genres. You got the pacing that's different, and like we talked about, the setting that's different. You see those techniques. For me, reading cross genres is about the techniques that the authors use, the language that they use. So you want to analyze it more than just read it. There's nothing wrong with reading for pleasure, but when you're reading as an author, you may want to read more critically into it and look at the style and the tone that people put into their work. And I know I mentioned word choice, but that's also a really big thing, not just with high language or simplistic language or whatever, but you can guide the reader to think something by using certain words. I always use Gillian Flynn's Gone Girl as an example of that, because the language that she uses, her word choice and patterns to that, lead you to believe one thing when something else is actually true. And then in that second perspective's reveal, the language used is different there to make you believe something else that may or may not be true. So I think that when you read across the genres, you really need to read critically and look into what's being commented on by the author and how they're doing it, and even maybe why, so that you can get those different perspectives on how things are, and that, and you'll get this feel for it, and you'll be able to write better because you have looked at all different ways to do things and get this. Maybe it's a coming of age story. Well, there's tons of them out there, and that can mean not just from adolescence, but it can also be through something like a divorce. That's another coming of age story. Or maybe somebody going into and putting their mother or father into a nursing home. There's another coming of age story. And they're all different, but they have that transfer, from one point of life to another, that's in, like I said, multiple genres of things. Um, it's kind of my opinion there.
It's a good one. What you've moved us into is exactly where I wanted to get to, actually, which is you're not just crafting like a story. I think oftentimes people forget about this, but when you are reading, or writing for that matter, you're improving yourself as an author. And that is something that gets woefully neglected in terms of an idea. Um, to the point where actually it depends on where you're at. So while I'm in grad school, everyone is focused on improving the quality of their prose. But upon graduating and entering into the market on my own and interacting with other authors, I actually find that particularly among the like people self-publishing and independently publishing, which I myself do, there is a unfortunate, and I should say, there is an unfortunate disdain for this analytical side of reading. There is this attitude like, oh, those are the snooty academics who focus on the composition of a piece or the technical aspects of story writing. And they abandon it. And the problem with that is they don't understand why they like the things that they like. They don't understand why the novels that work for them work. And I think that also inhibits their ability to enjoy things outside of what is immediately pleasurable. What do I mean? Well, if I'm aware of what makes a story work, I can now see it in something that is not immediately pleasurable, right? So if I understand great characterization, if I understand depth of theme, and how that's communicated. If I understand plot to a sophisticated degree, then I don't know if I pick up a Dostoevsky novel and it's going to be slow, so the pacing is going to be like not as great as I would be, wanting it to be. But if I can appreciate the characterization, if I can appreciate the, let's say, layered complexities to the plot that are going on in this massive genre, if I could appreciate the themes that are being very subtly communicated, because I can identify them as they're being presented to me, it actually allows me to enjoy reading that book more and, to get far enough into it where I become invested. And what that will then teach me is how to better do what, let's say, in this case, a literary Russian classic does, that will be unavailable to me if I am not able to read analytically, right? So reading outside your typical preferred genre, even if we expand that onto like poetry, like maybe you don't like enjoy reading poetry, but maybe you should try, right? If you're out there, listeners, because you'll find that even though you don't like it, once you recognize, let's say, how rhyme scheme work or the other elements of sound that often get quite neglected, like consonants and assonants, which are essentially forms of alliteration, and once you understand how to, let's say, use simile and metaphor, like a lot of people won't understand that a simile is often more specific than a metaphor is. And so depending on what you're describing using your figurative language, it's not merely, arbitrary preference. It's like sometimes a simile is better. If I'm describing a character's fingers, it makes more sense to say his fingers look like sausages. But if I'm describing a whole person and their attitude, I might say, well, he's a pig. And when I say he's a pig, that means a whole bunch of things, right? Because a metaphor is typically much more broad, where a simile is more specific. And then all of a sudden, you know how to use these elements that were otherwise removed from you. And I think that's really, really an important reason. You need to read and read outside, because you'll improve your analytical skills, which will allow you to read more, which will improve your skills specifically as an author. Another example, and
One
you can
thing
tell
I
me what you,
wanted to say
oh, go,
before we move
jump
on,
in.
before we move on, I wanted to say something about the poetry thing. You'd mentioned the rhyming scheme, but another thing that poetry teaches you is rhythm. There's a rhythm to sentences and sentence structure that is important, especially when you're writing or, well, editing actually. That when you're looking back through things and you're reading this really long sentence necessary, and it's like, okay, I think I need to make these, two or possibly even three sentences because I'm losing the subject in it. When you change it to be shorter, you need to keep that rhythm that was created in the original. So I don't know how to say it other than when you read it, when you read something that doesn't have the right rhythm, you feel like something is off about it. You may not be able to pinpoint why exactly, but you can feel that, okay, that was a really, really short sentence. I don't know why, it was only three words, or oh, that three words fits perfectly there. Um, so that rhythm that authors have, and it's unique to most authors, but it's also, in our language, in the English language, we have that rhythm, whereas opposed to Italians going to have a different rhythm into their language as well. And so what we have may not sound as great when it's translated. So we would need to change it in order to fit our rhythm of how we speak and how we read. So I think poetry really helps with that because of that rhythm and necessarily because of the rhyme in each line. That's all I wanted to say.
Oh, no, thank you for bringing that up, because that's actually something I fixate on. It reduces my daily word count by an unimaginable amount, because I listen to every single
Mm-hmm.
sentence that I
Yeah.
write, and if it does not, and this has to do, for those of you who've done an analysis of poetry, with stressed and unstressed syllables, the syllable count in a sentence relative to the syllable counts and the other sentences around it, and the stressed and unstressed syllables. And it's not like a mathematical formula, unless you want to sound like a sing song, which is terrible. But there
No,
is,
wait
so
a
you're
minute. Not all sing songs are terrible.
mostly not, but
Rhyme of
when you
the
read them,
Ancient Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner is awesome.
well, there will be some that work, but for the most part, you've heard when the author, and I've been guilty of this myself, and even sometimes, like, what was it? I was encouraged to read a couple of the Wizard of Earthsea novels, and in the first one with Ursula K. Le Guin, there are a few sentences that go back and forth where she plays on the rhyme, but it feels a bit like a nursery rhyme, and it doesn't come
Yeah.
off very great. But for the most part, you mentioned you can't really describe it, and that's correct. You can only feel it. But poetry definitely helps you feel that, and that's even worth talking about just a tiny bit, because I've thought a lot about what the hell is that, right? Because it's a bit mysterious. But I think that there is something. The only way I could describe it is music, right? So this is getting a little bit afield, but I think it's worthwhile. So I think it was Richard Wagner who had this idea that music was the most pure art form because it doesn't make direct reference to anything else. So you can have a sound that doesn't sound anything like what it makes you feel like. So you can have like there are certain tones that are sadness, essentially, even though no one makes that noise when they're sad. There's something about it that triggers that emotion in us, or happiness, or levity, or humor, or wrath and anger. There, for whatever reason, certain tones trigger those emotions and those associations inside
It's
us.
not just it's not just the tones, but also the words and how we say them. So, like S words are more calming for the most part because they kind of slip out of our mouths. And I mean, we hear that as well. But, I just wanted to put that in there. That certain words evoke a certain, just by the way we say them, evoke a certain emotion or connotation.
Yeah, well, the S's especially, they are smooth, right? They are swift. They slip out. They're a little bit like the water and the wind in that way. W's also, you'll
Yeah.
notice. I just used it there. Yeah, so when people are writing, focusing, reading poetry, that will help you feel the music, right? There's a quote. I think it gets attributed to Nietzsche a lot, though I've read almost all of Nietzsche's works, and he doesn't say it anywhere. But it's those who saw them there thought them mad, for they could not hear the music. And I sit there and say that to myself almost every single day when I'm reading things, because I've read things where you can tell if someone has actually done any amount of analytical work, either with music, like you can do this with music lyrics or music itself, instrumentals even, or poetry, which would be the easiest way in for an author, I think, um, where you can tell whether or not the person is listening, or if they are kind of vomiting their thoughts onto the page without making reference to, is this appealing to some, let's say, what's the right word for it? Something else inside the human being other than merely the content, the information. Is it playing upon them artistically?
Mhm.
um, but I could ramble about that all day. One thing I did want to cover is an idea that I talked about with my uh, friend and fellow author Nathan Cumberledge. He's been on the podcast quite a number of times, and we talked about originality. Now, originality for its own sake, I don't even think is actually desirable, but we don't want a work to feel stale. Right. When a work feels derivative, like extremely derivative, that often is off putting to most readers. And his advice, and you can tell me what you think about it, was like, if your work feels derivative, you are not reading a wide enough breadth of source materials. Like, you need to read more different things, because what's happening is you're essentially, he described it as like literary incest, which I think, yeah,
Wow.
right. But I think it's good, right? Because what ends up happening is you get this dysfunctional thing that's not inspiring, right? So if I only read one narrow line of genres and settings and plot types, then what I end up getting out is something that essentially doesn't inspire the reader. It's definitely not going to inspire another author to write something, and so it fails to reproduce itself. And it's sort of like the an inbred offspring that becomes infertile over time. um and so what do you think of that idea? That's kind of a crass way to put it.
Yeah, I probably would never say that. But yeah, I understand what they're saying there. Like this goes back to the beginning of what you were saying with the genres and subgenres and combinations of genres and all that kind of thing. And that is how that happened, as opposed to being just one track of um, action adventure type style, just one track of that. When somebody read romance, they put that into it. And so now we have a little bit of YA romance. And it doesn't have to be, an out and out love affair or anything, but the fact that there's an emotional relationship between two characters that includes love. Now we have an action adventure love story as well. So, yeah, merging to or reading multiple genres leads to that combination of genres that we are seeing a lot of. I mean, and it doesn't just have to be two. There are books that mash up 3 to 4 genres now, or original genres of what we thought of before. So, and I think that does come from reading multiple ones. And if you do just read one, yeah, you're only going to have a certain set of information and techniques to pull from. And so, yeah, it becomes kind of boring in a way to read the same thing. And when you write, you're not going to have that broadened mind in order to pull other things into it.
All right, speaking of broadened minds, Kristen,
Mm-hmm.
um, since we've gone on for a while, I wanted to, before we run out of time here today, talk about things that we in particular read that are outside of perhaps the genres that either of us maybe write in, but are certainly of varying genres. So, what is it that you typically will read, and also what might you advise that people read? So that they have a broader scope. If you don't have anything prepared or listed right away, I could go through some of the things that I typically do first.
I do have a list of books that I came up with, but they're different. I'll get to those in a minute. I have been reading recently a lot of mystery novels, psychological thrillers, those kind of things. Um, but I also enjoy the fantasy of vampires and magic and witches and those kind of things. I'm actually co-writing a book right now and that has courtesans and they are witches, so it's pretty cool. Um, but I also have I've worked on harem novels, which I'd never read before in my life. And that's kind of how I got my start, was doing harem novels, which is completely new experience for me. I did enjoy it. I enjoyed it a lot. Having multiple relationships, and I was surprised at how much plot and action did not involve that romantic relationship, but how the author pulled that into it was really fantastic. I was impressed by it, and I still am. Let's see, what else do I read? Of course, I read the classics too. I read Jane Austen and such like that, just because I enjoy reading those. I started out reading them because I felt like I should be cultured and read all that stuff, but I do enjoy them. So now I'll just pick one up randomly and read it whenever I want. The books, though, that I have on my list for suggestions are more to enhance the author's skills. So they're ones that are written in omniscient, a few in second person, and then I have some craft books to mention. Is that okay?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, anything.
Okay. So to get because a lot of authors think they're writing in omniscient, but they actually head hopping around the characters, or they think they're writing in third person, but they're actually, again, that head hopping from one character's thoughts to another, or from one character's intentions to another. I think it's important to read omniscient and get a sense for that. So there are a few books, and these range from in a different genres as well. Beartown by Frederick Backman, Gossip Girl by Cecilia von Ziegler. I think it's Ziegler. Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. Good Omens by Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett. The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak. And The Girl Who Drank the Moon by Kelly Barnhill. Those have a lot of they're really good, but there's a wide variety there, from realism to, sorry, to fantasy to what is unfortunately classified as general fiction, and literary fiction. So you get a wide range of genres, as well as having it all be in an omniscient perspective. And then for second person, which to me is the most difficult to write, The Night Circus by Aaron Morgenstern, Brass by and I can't pronounce this last name, to be honest with you. I'm not really sure. Let's just say their last name is, well, I can pronounce the last name, Aliu. Um, and then there's the fifth season by N.K. Jemisin. And those are really good for second person. And there aren't very many books, honestly, written in second person. It's mostly third person, and even close third person as opposed to distant third. And then the craft books, and this comes with storytelling, storyline, plot, and other aspects of writing. It would be, if you're writing fantasy, the Fantasy Fiction Formula by Deborah Chester. Goal, Motivation, Conflict by Deborah Dixon, which is fantastic. The Emotion Thesaurus, A Writer's Guide to Character Expression by Deborah Puglisi and Angela Ackerman. We talked a lot about evoking emotions in our readers, and this is one of them that goes in depth on how to do that. And then for plot, you'll hear this a lot as a suggestion, and it's because it's not just really good at showing you what plot points to hit, but also when to hit them, why they work. And that's Save the Cat Writes a Novel by Jessica Brody. Now there's a Save the Cat movie screenplay one, but this is the novel one, and it is really good. It breaks it down, and I'm not saying that you have to follow these things in order to have a successful novel, but it does give you the concept and the idea of this is what works, this is why it works, and if you choose to deviate from it, you should have a reason for it, because readers expect these things to be in the book. That's what I got for suggested reading for those three things.
Well, thank you. That was a quite extensive
I
list.
know. Sorry.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's great because a lot of that, I'm sure my typical listeners would not be as familiar with. I certainly, a lot of most of those have not read, and probably should. So, those of you guys listening, remember you can go back, you know, rewind, as they say, from the days of the VHS tape, and give those lists a listen again and pick out some things that sound interesting to you. Particularly the craft books are interesting, probably vital. So,
I
uh,
wanted to say about the craft books, these, I know people don't want to read them because they think they're going to be boring and they're just being told what to do, but these books are actually quite interesting. They tell things in a entertaining way, especially Save the Cat. I mean, that one's just, it's, the guy's funny, or she's funny, sorry, she's funny when she's writing, but so it tells you in an entertaining way, and you're reading another type of genre. So it's exposure to something else.
yeah, it's important. What I learned when I was in grad school was the importance of this is not that you read something like that and then you have to follow it. The
Mm,
importance is when you have it, when things are going wrong, you have something to use as a measure to fix what's going wrong. Because
yeah,
this is the important bit, right? It's not like read this craft book and follow it. It's
right.
read this craft book, and when you're doing your writing and you notice you're writing yourself into a corner, or you keep having plot holes, or people keep telling you your characters are flat, or whatever your problems happen to be, and you will have them. If you have, like, oh, hey, by the way, if you're writing flat characters, you're probably doing X, Y, or Z wrong. Check if you're doing X, Y, or Z wrong, and that at least gives you a place to start, right? Rather than being in the dark. And my recommendations actually are drier than a craft book. I think no one's going to want to hear this, right? But I think a lot of authors out there need to get a basic book on grammar and read it.
Oh,
So,
man.
what? Yeah, yeah, right. So this is what I'm going to say. My part of my little story. I got my undergraduate degree in exercise physiology, not in writing and literature. Now, I started writing my first novel when I was in um, college, right? So I was doing my undergraduate degree, and I noticed right away when I was doing that, like, oh, my like basic writing skills are not proficient enough for me to do what I'm trying to do. Like I noticed I was struggling to construct sentences properly. Like we mentioned before, they need to sound proper. They need to be the proper length and the right rhythm so that they read well. And my sentences were reading very badly. So I went and bought a couple books on grammar, and I remember a particular weekend. I spent 6 hours Saturday and Sunday on that weekend reading through these books on grammar. Right, most of it reading about commas, which is quite dry.
Good
Uh,
luck.
well, commas are a huge pain. But I'm saying to all you authors out there, if you have your fundamentals down, you will be much better off. So yes, read the crap books and then get a book on English grammar and syntax. Do it and read it. And you're going to, and it could be like an old textbook because I find older textbooks typically are better. Modern textbooks are not shockingly useless. Um, you know, I've been in academia and I've done a little bit of cursory research into the way that those are written, and they are actually like literally a combination of well-intentioned mistakes in editing per edition and then a racket with the addition. So like, find older books on grammar and syntax if you can. But there are certain ones that aren't like textbooks that are just out there in your local bookstore. Grab one. Aside from that,
I think we
I
do
would
think a lot of,
go
I'm
ahead.
sorry, I think we do think a lot of nonfiction is like a textbook. But yeah, that's actually not true. um, Now, the Chicago Manual Style, that's like a textbook. So I don't recommend authors need to get that book. I do have two recommendations for the sentence level and grammar, if I can go with that.
Please do.
Okay, so the first one is Editing Fiction at Sentence Level, and that's by Louise Hornby. She uses a ton of examples in hers, and it's really good for breaking the rules. And I know you're talking about learning the grammar rules, but she does go over what the rules are and then in what cases they are looked upon as good in breaking them and why it's done by these certain authors. So I think it's really good for that. And then the other one is actually a Chicago guide to copy editing fiction by Amy Schneider. This one just recently came out, and they did it because there was nothing for fiction in the original Chicago Manual Style. So it's kind of a helpful book, and they're entertaining. I swear they are. But you can learn about how to copy edit. So and even with just learning to copy edit, you're learning how to write with using correct grammar, and then again when to break it, because in fiction we do tend to break those grammar rules a lot, but we do need to know them in order to know when to break them.
Absolutely. We, as an analog, so I did a traditional martial arts style for a long time, and it was the same kind of rule. Like in real life, when you actually execute things, you don't do the textbook way. But if you can't do the textbook way, you will fail when you try to improvise more often than you will succeed because there's skills involved with learning the formal structured method that are necessary for the proper execution. Um, Aside from just grammar books, though, I actually recommend many authors read a lot of nonfiction, particularly in regard to ideas. I find that if you want, now, even if you just want to write escapist literature, I think you should do this because I think your escapist literature will be like generic candy if you don't have anything richer in there for the reader. The reader, even if they don't realize it, likes to feel like they've gained or learned something or that they've developed some way, shape, or how in the reading of their book, even if the morals of your book are very simple. And to actually be able to embed those things into your novel not even consciously, even if you don't even mean to do it, you have to have some of these ideas in your head. And in order to have that verisimilitude that we talked about before, you actually have to have a broad enough reading to be able to accurately represent them. So, for instance, I know I deal with a lot of authors now, particularly younger authors, particularly young guys, who have been heavily influenced by, let's say, like Japanese animation. It's very, very popular. And then they come into literature and they've got a lot of these, you know, themes and settings they want to cover that are inspired by, I don't know, let's say Japanese culture. It's like, well, did you read any of the Japanese history or philosophy or the Chinese or Indian philosophies that those are derived from? Because if you didn't, then you're going to fail. To say it bluntly, or if you're trying to cover some deep ethical or political thing, like go read a bunch of old political manuscripts. Read, especially the ones that you don't like. Definitely go read those ones. 100%. Because the antagonist in your book should be believable if you're going to do that. If you don't want to, write a straw man of your opposite positions. And also if you want to be able to write in such a way that your characters think and act in a believable way, which is to say, at least semi coherently, because to be frank, normal people aren't entirely coherent. So you can go too far with this, right? Like, don't read a ton of Aristotle and then write characters that think like Aristotle, because he was definitely nothing wrong with being autistic, but he was hyper autistic. Like, everything is hyper systematized, and like nobody thinks like Aristotle writes at all, ever, ever, ever. But definitely read it so that you can have an understanding there of how these ideas logically follow for one another. So when they pop up in your fiction, it doesn't feel like the what I like this word, this phrase rather, that's typically used as skin suit, right? That it doesn't feel like you're putting on a show or trying to be pretentious and pretend at depth, right? Because there's nothing worse than reading someone pretending to be deep. In terms of fiction, though, I would also recommend people read some of the classics. They're dry, they're hard to get through, but I know that getting through, and translations even can be very good. Now they're going to have their weaknesses, like you mentioned before, but reading through Goethe's Faust, and then pair that with something originally in English, like Paradise Lost with John Milton, that's going to be very, very helpful. I mentioned Dostoevsky. I never got all the way through War and Peace by Tolstoy. Um, Hopefully one day I have time to get all the way through it. Now I've read a bunch by Gogol. You can tell I like the Russians. Gogol's stuff is really great, by the way. It's like these folk stories, and they have a lot of these. It's not magical realism. I don't even like that term, but it feels something like magical realism in a very folky kind of way that we don't see quite a lot anymore. Um, I've read, I haven't gotten all the way through because it's also extremely long, Journey to the West, but at least get through like the part with Sun Wukong, because it's like the first giant chunk of it. And there is a lot of good story structure, particularly thematic depth in that. Reading mythology in general is a great idea for that reason, because there are a lot of ideas that let's say harken back to the ancient ages, if I say that correctly. Or even reading different religious books will help you, right? Like go read, now that telling someone to go read a Bible and the Quran or something like that is probably too much, because that would take a very long time. But if you have the time to do it, I would recommend people do that, because it is going to inform you about the bedrocks of culture in such a way that your writing will be much, much, much deeper. That would be my writing recommendations: classics, and lots of philosophy, and then, like I mentioned before, grammar. All right. Well, we have chatted on for quite a while. Thank you, Kristin,
Yeah.
for joining me so long. Is there anything else in particular to this topic that you wanted to talk about before we bring it to a close?
No, I think we did an excellent job covering it.
Awesome. All right. Well, before we go, I will send you all to the place where I always send you, wildislelit.com. As a quick reminder, I've got all kind of things there on the site. I've got stories and excerpts, essays, blog posts. I write aphorisms each week if you like those, if you're like me, a Nietzsche fan. The podcasts are also there. You can check out my editing service, particularly focusing in on stylistic line editing, the Wild Isle Style Guide. And if you want to check out my novel, Want Smoke Broken, you can find links there, as well as you can listen to the whole thing on audio, either on my website or SoundCloud or Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And I put the whole thing on YouTube. It's everywhere. There is no reason that you should not listen to this book that I made available to you for free. So listen to it. Tell me what you think. Leave a review out there on Amazon, because that would help me quite a bit. And Kristin,
Yes.
again, remind everyone where they can check out your stuff.
You can check me out at nolandediting.com. I do have some author resources there. I've done 2 courses on developmental editing. If you'd like to take a look at, there's one for authors and one for editors. If you want to take a look at that, and you can always book a chat with me on the consultations tab. So I'd look forward to meeting some of you. I think that'd be great.
Please do check out Kristin's site and check out her services. It is all quite excellent. All right, guys, thank you for listening in, and we will see you guys next time.
Thank you, Marquise.